Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar series. We're working through some technical issues to allow me to be able to present my screen. But in the meantime, I just wanted to reach out, let everybody know that we're going to be talking about measuring and tracking soil health in this session. And with that, that's most going to cover our ability to help you collect samples in season in real time, and then turn around and import those into FarmQA to help make management decisions. So that will be the main focus of our demo today. And with that, you should be able to see my screen. And so as I walk through the agenda here, we're going to talk through how you can mark and track soil sample locations. You can navigate between sampling zones or grid samples. And then you could also upload that data from any lab. So the goal there being is an agnostic import from our side. And then from there, we'll talk through how we could visualize that data in several different ways through using our analytics tools. And then additionally, how you could use FarmQA as a grower portal to then house that data in a place that the growers can access it and see it on their own. So that will be the discussion for today, and we will dive in. I want to spend most of my time in a live demo walking through this process with you. And so with that being said, I've jumped into Controller. This is our web-based platform and that accompanies the mobile application. There's a couple things that we'll step through. We mentioned how to mark locations for sampling, and that'll be kind of the first piece of things, is how we can help you in field collect those samples, and then we'll talk to the upload process as a secondary step. So with that, there's a couple different sampling methods that exist, but the first one we'll walk through is simply the scenario of a zone scenario where you're collecting data or samples based on a zone map. And so what we have here is I'm displaying a zone map within FarmQA Controller. And what this is within the map layer component of FarmQA, we've uploaded a shapefile, a KML, KMZ, or GeoTIFF file that contains an existing zone. And so that's one thing to note on the zone front, is that we don't currently have the ability to create zones. And so you would need an existing zone file like this coming out of a different software platform that we could simply upload and visualize that data set. And that's what's happening in this scenario. And so with that, we have a previous video that does dig in a little bit deeper on map layers as far as what file types we support, how to upload. But the thing I want to point out now is that just briefly within settings of your account, you can create buckets or folders, if you will, for different map layer types. And so in my scenario, you can use this blue button in the bottom left to create a file for your variable rate zone maps. And again, think of this step as just creating the files to then house those zone maps field by field, so that when you come to a point where you want and you're ready to upload a file, that's where you can come into the field, click on it, open up or expand your layer section, and then you can add a map layer, select what folder it's going to go in, so variable rate zone map in my case, and this is where you can drag and drop a shapefile into this left-hand pane, or click here to navigate your computer, and then you can locate those files and it would upload and display in a way you're seeing here. Again, I want to reserve a lot of this time for talking about the import tools, so just note that if it doesn't visualize the way you want, we do have some tools to edit the layer itself, and I would suggest that you watch my previous YouTube video on the layers. That would help you understand how to do that. Regardless, that's the general upload process. Then the value of doing this is that you can take that layer to the mobile application. So now we'll talk through the scenario of you're in the field, you're perhaps in a four-wheeler ready to collect these samples. What you can do is, first of all, locate the field from your map view or your list view within the mobile application. Click on it, and that will bring you into the details of this field. So one thing to note, this does run on iPhone, Android, tablets, computers, whatever you want to bring to the field, this will function on. But once you have clicked on this field, you can swipe up from the bottom, which brings up the data layers that we can display. And in my case, I've uploaded that zone map, which I had talked through on the web view. And this is simply allowing me to display that well in the app. And you can see how I can toggle between layers if I do happen to have, let's say, sampling pins and zones. you can see how I could toggle between the two options there to display one or the other. Now, the value or how we help you collect is by showing you your GPS location. So if you were physically in this field, you would see a circle representing your GPS, and you'd be able to know what zones you're in at any given time. And then within this, if you did happen to want to actually drop pins, you can click, and what you can do from this menu is you can either set up a soil sampling template or simply just drop an observation point, which, as you can see there, would then represent your sampling location. Once you do this, let's say you've got, so that was in zone 1, you could continue on and drop these pins in the different zones, and you can see how that map would get built out as you collect. You could then export that out as an Excel file containing the lat and longs of each of these pins, or we could then import data and associate it back to that data set. So again, the value here is displaying the map layer, navigation with seeing your location projected on top of that file. One additional note I want to make as we talk about map layers is within the settings of your phone, we have a layer sync preferences tab, and this is going to allow you to choose which layers you want to sync down onto your mobile application. The reason you might want to do this, if you're working with a lot of data, a lot of fields, a lot of farms, you may want to control to, let's say you're in the fall, perhaps you no longer care about your seeding maps or your imagery, and you just want to go into sampling mode, then that might be a good time to toggle off some of these other layers. Oops, I want to leave sampling points on. And then that way, it's a lighter version of the app, if you will. We're pulling down less data. Once we do that, that will force a sync to happen on the mobile application, and it will make those layers available to you to go out and sample. The second scenario to discuss here would be a grid sampling scenario. And in my case, I will jump over to a scenario that has, or field that has pins. So again, similar scenario here is if you've got an existing set of pins, you can upload this as a map layer, and it will display in this fashion. What you can do with that is the labels you see here, 5, 7, 12, etc. These are, you can choose an attribute to use as the pin ID or the pin label, and that's what you're seeing there. So if that is contained within your upload, again, shapefile, KMLs, CSVs, that would result in this being created, and you can then display it on the mobile app. Similar to the zone map, we would then allow you to navigate in the field pin to pin to help you collect this data. Now, that's the kind of the collection side of things, helping you navigate on the mobile app, iPad, Android. The next piece that we'll dig into is the import process that we have implemented. So if there's any questions on the collection side of things and what we're doing here, you can save those to the end, and I will make sure to address those. One last comment, if it is just a composite sample, you can drop a single pin. I mean, it doesn't have to be zones or the grids. It can just be a pin in the field, and we can associate the data back to that point. Now, talking through, you've collected the samples, you sent them to the lab, and perhaps you've got results back. What you can do within FarmQA is, first of all, I'll pull up some demo data. So let's say you've got a file back from the lab. The key thing to note as far as what we can accept and what we can import, the file needs to be an Excel file in a .csv format, and we are going to map out the attributes within here to the farm and the field names. So you would want to make sure that the names within here, in my case, it's going to be the field ID. Make sure that those are an identical match to what's in FarmQA. That is our tool that we're going to use for matching, unless your lab happens to also produce lat and long coordinates with the export. If not, then it's going to be purely a name-based match. What we will do in this process as we move forward here is if you do attempt to import fields, but there's not an exact match, we will spit out a separate file of just the failures so that you can continue to correct the field names until all data gets pushed into FarmQA. Okay, so this is a scenario where this is corresponding back to the grid scenario I was discussing. So if we pull up and we'll look at kind of side-by-side view here of the grids, and what I'm pointing out here is that within the Excel file, if you have a grid scenario and we turn on these points, the sample ID right here is going to be what we use to correspond this lab results back to the pins. And so if you do want that spatial reference for where your results were collected, we're going to map up sample ID to the pins and the attributes within that map layer file. So keep that in mind. Then the other thing to note here is that to actually import, we're going to do this from controller. So we'll move away from the Excel file for now and walk through just a location of the import tool. We've placed this within the soil tab and the soil measurements import. Now, for those who are looking at this today, it's currently under a feature flag is what we call it, because it's currently in beta, and we want to make sure people watch a video like this to make sure that they're importing correctly. So we will be sending out a link in a future email with the unique URL to get to this import process. Regardless, this will be the experience that you have once you enter that URL. And the soil tab, soil measurement import, is the place you'd want to navigate to. A key piece to what we're doing here within our import tool is allowing you to create profiles. And I need to jump over to my other demo account here. So if we look at the soil import profile dropdown, I've already created several profiles, but the nice thing about what we're doing here is going back to trying to be agnostic when it comes to importing data. You could create different profiles if perhaps you work with multiple labs. Maybe you have some petiole samples and soil samples. You can create different profiles for those. And then FarmQA, we would standardize that data during the import process and bring that in. So what I mean in a little bit more detail, we'll talk through just the starting point of how to create a profile. So the way it works is we'll click this black plus button, and it will say drag and drop a CSV file in so that it's looking at roughly the standard layout of the files that you plan to be bringing in. So what I'll do here is I've got this agvice demos.csv. So I will drag this into the drop zone, or you could simply click on that drop zone and search your file. From here, we're going to give the profile a name. So we'll just call this agvice and the full package. Who is it from? It's from agvice. Now, this is where we start to map out when we're looking at the CSV file and the import profile. We want to make sure that we're properly matching up the headers right here with what we're going to call things in FarmQA. So in this case, I've got a grower ID from my CSV file. So I simply click the drop down, which serves up to me all the different attributes in that file I dropped in. The field, I'm going to use the field ID column. The sample ID, again, this goes back to the grid scenario. If you want to map out to the individual pins, you can use that sample ID attribute. You can leave that one blank. The field names and grower, those are required attributes. The other ones are not. So in this case, I'll actually leave the sampling date blank. If that was included, you could choose the attribute for that. And then let's talk through a scenario. If you don't have pre-existing pins on your map view, this will automatically do that for you. If you toggle this option on, is what you're seeing here with the create new geomarkers. Regardless, the next step brings us to a screen of saying, which of the columns that we saw in the Excel file do you want to import? And so in this case, the submitter, date, rex, reference number, that's not actual data that I want to import. So I will just simply start checking through the nutrients I would like to upload. One thing to note is looking at my Excel file, I don't have any results for the PB1, and so I won't actually check that. And so that's roughly what we're doing here is we just want to check the columns that we actually have data for. And I'll just check a few more random ones. But then at this point, if we click next, this brings us to really the main screen that we want to make sure to set up properly. And just note as I'm walking through this, the profile creation is really a one-time setup. So the clicking of the buttons and picking attributes, you set that up once and you really shouldn't have to change it going forward or make new profiles. But anyway, this is the process where we're going to associate. I'll go back to full screen here. Associate. This is what our import said was an attribute or column. What property, soil property is that? And so you can start to map out from our drop-down list what nutrients these tag into. And then as we look through here, we can see the next option is units of measure. We'll take our best guess at the units based on your preferences in the settings tab. And so we're assuming that potassium is going to be in parts per million, but you can still choose an alternative option. So let's say your lab is actually testing that in pounds per acre. You could override our defaults and select what units are actually there. So we continue to build that out for all the nutrients. For depth, what you can do is on the bottom left, you can add soil depths. And so what this is you could say this is my topsoil and say it's 0 through 12 and save that. And you can do the same thing for subsoil, but call it 12 through 24 if you're collecting it multi-depth samples. And I've already done this, so I won't click save, but that's the process. You click save and it would create a soil depth profile so that when you come to this screen, we've got these pre-made drop downs that we can pick from. And in my case, I've got the data that I'm looking at here is all one depth data, but a scenario where you might have a nitrogen 1 and a nitrogen 2 reading, that's where you could set the nitrogen 1 as topsoil, nitrogen 2 as subsoil, and we will note that those are different depths when we import the data. The last thing is metrics. And so this is taking into our analytics functionality and how we can visualize this data over time. You'll want to tag the nutrients to a metric within FarmQA. And so these are metrics you would pre-create or you can create during this process, where you could say this is, if we map this out to phosphorus and potassium, it's similar to what we did before in the drop downs. But the thing is, this is more or less where we standardize the data across labs because it's all going to flow into the same metric that we have created within the system. So within here, that's me choosing from predefined metrics. If you look in this list and you don't see which a nutrient, let's say zinc was not in here, and I'm trying to set that up for zinc, that's where from this view you can add a new soil metric, call it zinc. You could say, is this an existing metric? In my case, it knows that that name exists already, but for most cases, it would actually be add new, and you could give that a name, unit of measure in here, and then click save. Once you do that, it then becomes available in the drop-down list in the metric picker right here. So that is the process of creating a profile. I will show you one that is fully set up. So if you come in and note that you can edit these profiles using that pencil icon, but this would be a scenario of a profile that is set up, and note that you can adjust these in the edit mode like I was saying, but regardless, more or less a one-time setup. The next step to this process is to actually import the data. So what I will do is, first of all, we can select what organizational unit I want to import to. So in my case, I'm going to upload data to my North Dakota farms. I'm going to select what growing season that data gets uploaded to. And I'm going to give this an import date. In my case, I didn't define the date within the CSV file. And so I'm just explicitly giving a date. If that was an attribute that came in the CSV, we would recognize that and respect that date. Now the next step is, well, I need to choose a different profile. So I'm going to go over and use this webinar demo soil upload. Oops, let's reset everything. Let me quickly pick that. And again, this is where you'd want to, if you had multiple profiles, make sure you have the right profile from, let's say it's a different lab or tissue versus soil samples. But then I can upload my CSV file that corresponds to this data set. It's going to upload, and now we can see down at the bottom here, we have the imported soil sample files. So this is essentially each of the sessions that you've created within FarmQA. And so you can see that this was imported today at 2:19. So this is the one that I just uploaded, and it uploaded successfully with all the data inside of it. Now, a scenario I did want to talk through is I mentioned before, if you upload a file that it doesn't find field matches, or if there's an issue with perhaps the conversions, I'll show you a scenario where what that would look like in the experience for you. So I've selected a profile, I've got my CSV file, I will drag and drop it in the drop zone. But now in this case, I get an error. And as we scroll through here, we can see all the failures. And so this is essentially all the data failed. But what you're seeing in the failure reason, it's telling me the grower name or the field name was not found. So in a typical scenario, what happened, let's say you're trying to import 100 fields. It might match 75 of those and spit out 25 where it didn't have a name match. It might be, a scenario where it's misspelled, there's an S or no S, things like that. So you could then export that to a CSV. And now this will be just those 25 failures in my example, where you can come in here and correct the field name, and then try to re-import this corrected file. So that's where I was going back explaining how you could reiterate on that until you got all the data in via the import process. Okay, hopefully that's making sense so far. And the last piece I want to touch on here with our time together is once that data is in, what can you do with it? So there's a few ways to visualize the soil data. And the first way is from the map view. So if we want to, I'm going to go back into my other demo account. Oops, that was not correct. There you go. Now what we have within here, I'll show it in live data. What we have in here is we can turn on from our map view. I slid out my map pane and I can turn on my soil samples. What this is providing you is a view of pins of where the samples were actually collected. And we can see which fields have data. A key thing to note here is if you turn that layer on, you imported data and you don't see it, the most common reason would be down here, we are restricting what data gets shown on the map based on this time filter. So for example, if I was at last 7 days, I don't see any soil data, even though this is turned on. It's because I'm looking for soil data in the last 7 days. So be cognizant of that as you start to look for soil data that's been imported. Regardless, once you do find that data, you can zoom in. This was a PEDIL data set where I collected 15 samples in the same field in the same season. In this case, it all dropped in. I didn't have pins, and so it dropped on the centroid of the field. That will be your experience if you don't have lat and longs or you don't have grid points to map to. We will simply drop that file or that pin in the center of the field, but still allow you to view that data sample by sample, date by date within this view. The other thing that you can do within this is that you can click on the field itself. And let me jump back into here one more time. What you can do from this view is we will click on an individual field. I'll make sure it's one that has sampling data. And if we click on that, our analytics functionality within the right season allows us to see the soil data within the map detail pane on the left-hand side here. So as I scroll through here, this would actually be the average or the most recent value in this data set. So in the case of it being a PEDIL sample set, it'd be the most recent. If it was perhaps a zone scenario or a grid scenario where you don't have the pins, it's going to average that data and show that single value here on the left. But then within these icons here, this allows you to show the graph over time. So if you want to start looking at nitrogen trends, phosphorus trends over time, this is a nice way to do it from the map view. And this is available if you have the metric functionality. And my scenario is talking through week over week data. Same thing would go for year over year results, is still allowing you to see those trends over time. The third way to see this data is within the soil tab. So that's the same place we had the soil import tool. The use case here is that, again, you can filter it by time range, but these would be more or less listing out the barcodes of the samples so that if you had an issue with a particular sample or barcode, you could search it up here so that it would snap down across all your data and find that particular sample. But yeah, it's essentially a list view of your results. The final way to view the data, and perhaps the most interesting, is within our analytics view. So what we have here is within the report tab of analytics, what I'll do is we have the function to freeze some of the basic data as far as field names and the grower. You can clean up columns over here if you want to just refine this down to just showing your soil sample data. In my case, I'll leave some of the scouting information in here as well for comparison purposes. But as I scroll through the columns here, we're going to see that these correspond back to the lab results and those metrics that we had created. So you can see within here, this is where you'd have the ability to compare nitrogen versus yields or aphid pressures that you scouted for. But then similar to the map view, you can click on any one of these cells and be visualizing the trends over time for that field, for that nutrient. Another thing that you can do within this view is you can set filters. So if you want to see, this is a fairly limited data set, but if you wanted to see any field that had greater than, let's just say 50 pounds per acre of nitrogen, you can see that breaks down to just these fields. And then you could set a secondary filter on anything else you want. Let's say comparing tar spot to pH or different comparisons in this view. And then you can also export that to Excel if you got to a particular set of fields you were interested in analyzing and wanted to show that to others. That is an export option. Now, an additional way to be visualizing the same soil data set within FarmQA is via our metric designer. And what we're allowing you to do within this view is, first of all, you can start to view trends spatially or on a map. So what I'll do is I've zoomed into a couple fields here that I've uploaded data to, but because this was stamped to different time periods, you can click play in this case, and you can actually see the trends over time of nitrogen consumption. So this is our field averages map, and we give essentially a field color per field based on the nutrient levels that have been imported, so that you can see spatial differences across fields in this manner. Again, pedial samples here, so you can look at consumption. You can see which fields got side dressed in real time. A second option within this, as far as visualization goes, is that I've got a line chart set up. So if we look at the top left, these are the different charting options that we provide to you. In this case, if I am going to look at a line chart, this allows me to do a comparison across a couple different things. What we're looking at here is the nitrogen values across crops. So you can see my group by dimensions down here. I'm looking at corn nutrient levels versus, let's just say, potatoes. And you can turn those crops on and off to do a direct comparison this way. Hover over to see average values. And so again, that's what we're doing here. Let's say I had 50 cornfields last year. This is showing me the average value for that year, or actually this is for that week in my case. It's showing the average value across all those fields. Looking at these group by dimensions, you can see how you can also jump between grouping those by farm, grouping them by individual fields. And again, the same thing would go here if you want to break these down to a particular grower, or if you just wanted to compare several that you were having issues with, you can visually see that data set. We also have a group by variety in here. And then another piece to this is that you can overlay your recommendations. So if you start to make fertility applications, you can see how those came into play as notations projected on top of those graphs. So we'll kind of move on from there. One thing as far as displaying it back to a grower. So I mentioned grower portals. You can set up growers with access to FarmQA. And then once you create views, in our case, we're talking about soil data, you can add those into a dashboard. The dashboard is like what you're seeing here is the combination of different pre-created views that you've made within that metric designer, so that you can start to see trends across, at a glance, you can see calcium values versus nitrogen versus, I've got my yield data here by variety. And within this dashboard, you can add panes to this. So if you want to, add in a soil nitrate view, you can now add that in. You can choose to rearrange this. If you unlock these panes, you can move these around and get this into a particular configuration you like, and then save that. And then all these views would be saved for those growers to simply thumb through, like you're seeing up here, between your different data sets, so that they don't have to go through kind of those levers and dials to get these views created. So again, this is all based off of imports of CSV data, and you can see how that would be visualized within analytics here. One last thing to touch on is if you do import soil data and let's say those averages maps aren't looking the way you want, or there's too many decimal places, in analytics and in metrics, if you recall, when we were doing the import or creating the profile, we were setting up metrics, and this is where you can see those created metrics is within this tab. The left-hand side is where you can scroll through and see the details per metric. But some of the things you might want to do with this is that if you're looking at, for example, soil nitrogen, what you can do within this view is on the right-hand side, you can change the number of decimal places. So again, when you import it, let's say on that report tab, you're seeing 2 decimal places, maybe that's irrelevant for that result. You can adjust that here by just keying in a number. The next thing to note is we talked about the field averages map, where we give a fill color. This is where you can set the range for what triggers to be red versus what triggers to be green and everywhere in between. So you can set this up for a logical range for your data set, and then you can choose a color ramp. A lot of times I like that red to green, so you can choose that. But then in addition, you can invert. So let's just say you've got a data set where, in my case, 0 is typically low nitrogen, that's not good, so red's bad, and the high numbers, green is good. Let's say you had the reverse of that, where you had, high numbers were bad, low numbers were good. That's where you'd invert that scale, and then it would flip that color ramp on you when you visualize it within any of those map-based views. So, and then additionally, if you want to change the title of how things look, let's say it just says nitrogen, you could simplify that and just call it N, and that would condense your column spacing on your metric view. So just know that this is where you can edit any of those metrics that you created and save those, and it would take any of those changes that you had made.